Hello everyone, and welcome to Flow Fundamentals from the Automating Admin, the series designed to help Salesforce professionals learn flows. In our final video of the series, we'll go over tips and tricks not covered in the previous videos. These topics will cover functionalities related to flows, such as triggering from a button, as well as steps to take to make our flows more effective. By the end of this video, we'll learn how to create buttons to trigger our flows, how to notify users when a flow fails, how to disable flows using custom settings, how to evaluate if a record is new in a flow, the importance of documentation. Let's start with creating buttons to trigger our flows. When we want to trigger a ScreenFlow or auto-launched flow from a record page, one of the ways we can achieve this is by creating custom buttons or actions. To do this, go to the Object Manager and select the necessary object. Then go to Buttons, Links, and Actions. We can either use New Action or New Button or Link to create a button for the flow. Let's look at both options. When using New Action, we can select the action type to be Flow, and then select the necessary flow from the dropdown. Then, we fill in the remaining details, such as the label and name. Once saved, the action can be added via the page layout or Lightning App Builder. When using New Action to trigger a flow, make sure the flow has a variable labeled Record ID that is available for input. The New Action approach can only pass in a record's ID to this variable and cannot pass in any other values. If we need to pass in multiple variables, or we do not use the record ID to store our record ID variable, then we'll need to use the new button or link to create our button. This process is more complex compared to New Action. First, provide a label and name. Next, select the display type. If this button is on a record page, select Detail Page Button. Now we need to create the URL string. On another browser tab, open the Flow section and click View Details and Versions on the necessary flow. There is a field labeled URL. Copy this URL and then paste it into the new button or link URL text area. When a user clicks our button, this will tell Salesforce to navigate to our flow. Now it is time to set our variables. For this part, I recommend opening up the flow in another tab for reference. After the flow URL, add a question mark. Then, type the name of the first variable needed for input, being sure to match any capitalization. Then add an equal sign, and select the necessary merge field. In this example, I have put record ID equals the account ID. To add more variables, add an ampersand, and then repeat the process of putting the variable, then equals, and then a merge field. Once the URL is all configured, save the button and then add it to the page layout or Lightning page. Using this approach allows for multiple variables to be set, but can take longer to configure. Additionally, when a user presses this button, once the flow is finished, it loops back to the beginning unless we configure the URL properly. To have the flow navigate back to the records page, add the following to the URL formula. Ampersand ret URL equals the record ID. Our next tip is how to notify users when a flow fails. By default, when a flow encounters an error, the last person who modified that flow will get an error email. But we have the ability to notify multiple users or even external email addresses. We can do this by setting up Apex exception emails in Setup. When configured, Apex exception emails will send an email to specific users and addresses whenever a flow or Apex fails. To add a Salesforce user, click the Add Salesforce User button and then select the necessary person. We can also enter an external email address for notifications. This is a great option if we want to be notified on Slack or Microsoft Teams of any flow errors. We can create a channel, get the necessary email address for that channel, and add it here. These next two tips can be used inside our flows to make them more effective. The first is using custom settings to prevent flows from running. There will be some scenarios where we need to modify a large amount of Salesforce data, such as a data load update, but we don't want all of our automation to run. We could go to each flow and deactivate them, but this is time consuming. and will change the last modified date on the flow. What we can do, however, is leverage custom settings. If you've never used custom settings before, don't worry, because we'll walk through creating one. We are going to make a custom setting to disable flows at the object level. First, in Setup, navigate to Custom Settings. Click New. Provide a label and an object name. For this example, we'll name this Disable Flow Triggers. Click Save. Next, we'll need some checkboxes to indicate what objects flows we want to disable. Under the Custom Field section, click New and select Checkbox. Name your field. For this example, I entered Disable Opportunity Trigger. Click Next and then click Save. Repeat this process for any other objects where disabling triggers are needed. Before we check one of these boxes, we are going to update a flow to check for the trigger. In our flow, add a decision element at the very beginning. Name the element, such as Is Trigger Disabled? In the main branch criteria, select Custom Hierarchy Settings, and then select the necessary trigger checkbox, and then set equals to True. Update the flow to end if the checkbox is marked True, and have the flow proceed if false. What this will do is check the custom setting before performing any action, and if the box is checked, the flow stops. Now let's disable the flow via the custom setting. Navigate back to the custom setting and click Manage. Here, we can set the flow disable values for either the entire org or just specific users. For the org level, click New at the top of the page and check the necessary boxes. To remove the flow disable triggers, click Edit and uncheck the box. We can also do the same on a user basis. In the lower half of the page, click New. Set the drop-down to User and then enter the necessary user. Finally, check the corresponding boxes. And just like the org settings, be sure to edit the user to have the boxes unchecked once finished. When a flow checks custom settings, it will first look for a user setting, and if none is found, will default to the org level setting. If a user setting is present, it will always use that configuration. This means if a flow is disabled for the entire org, but I have my own setting where it is enabled, the flow will still run for me. For our second flow building tip, sometimes when building a record-triggered flow, we need it to run on both create or update, but certain actions should only occur on create. While currently, the only standard way to achieve this is by making two separate flows, where one is for create only and the other is for update only, we can instead use a formula field and keep everything in one single flow. To do this, in our flow, we will create a new formula resource labeled ISNEW. The output will be Boolean, meaning it will either give us a true or false output. The formula is simple. Just type ISNEW and then open and close parenthesis. This formula will evaluate if the record was just created, and if it was, will output a value of true. We can then use this formula field in decision elements to determine what actions to take. We could have the flow perform actions on just create or just update without needing multiple flows. The final tip is one that has been touched on briefly throughout the other videos, but it bears repeating. Always add a description to every part of your flow. The flow's resources and elements all have description fields, as does the flow itself. Make sure every one of these has some description, even if it feels self-explanatory. Put why the resource or element was created and what it does. That way, if you need to revisit the flow after a long gap in time, you can understand why the flow was set up the way it was. And that wraps it up for the Flow Fundamentals video series. If you enjoyed today's topic, be sure to like and subscribe, as we'll have more flow videos in the future. We also regularly post short-form flow content. Thank you all for watching, and I will see y'all later.